The first sign that an ordinary Wednesday in Moscow had irrevocably veered into the extraordinary was not a gunshot or an explosion, but an echo. The pervasive low-frequency rumble of the city's traffic, a constant heartbeat for over 13 million people, began to fade. On the Garden Ring Road, a perpetual river of steel, the flow slowed to a trickle. By mid-morning, the iconic avenues Toverskaya, Novierbot, Kutuzovsky Prospect stood eerily vacant, littered with abandoned vehicles, some with doors still ajar, as if their occupants had evaporated into the cold air. This was not a scheduled holiday or a police cordon. This was the beginning of a rapid, spontaneous evacuation, a metropolitan panic unfolding in near silence, triggered by a seismic shift in power that had occurred in the dead of night. The Russian capital, the fortified heart of the Federation's political and financial power, was emptying out. The catalyst was a terse 57-second announcement broadcast on all state television channels at precisely 5:47 Moscow time. It featured not President Vladimir Putin, nor the chairman of the State Duma, nor any civilian official. Instead, it showed five men seated behind a plain table dressed in the solemn dark uniforms of the Russian military's high command. At the center was General Andrei Saravikin, a figure whose stern demeanor and reputation for brutal efficiency in Syria had earned him the public nickname General Armageddon. Flanked by the chiefs of the ground forces, aerospace forces, and the commanders of the western and central military districts, Sarain read from a sheet of paper, his voice devoid of inflection. The Council for the National Restoration of Order has assumed all executive and legislative authority in the Russian Federation. He stated, "This action is taken to preserve the constitutional integrity of the state, to secure its borders, and to stabilize the national economy for the duration of the current crisis. All civilian organs of power are hereby suspended. A curfew from 20 to 6 is in immediate effect for Moscow, St. Petersburg, and all administrative capitals. We urge citizens to remain calm and attend to their duties. The armed forces are in control." There was no mention of President Putin's whereabouts, health, or status. No explanation of what crisis specifically necessitated such a drastic measure. The statement concluded with a warning against acts of provocation and destabilization, promising a severe response. Then the broadcast returned to its regularly scheduled programming, a children's cartoon. The ambiguity was more terrifying than any detailed manifesto. In the absence of information, rumor became currency, spreading through encrypted messaging apps and whispered conversations in apartment building stairwells. The most persistent theory, citing sources in the security apparatus, claimed that a protracted and violent confrontation had taken place within the Kremlin walls between the Presidential Security Service loyal to Putin and elements of the Federal Protective Service and the Ministry of Defense. Unconfirmed reports spoke of armored vehicles breaching the Spassky Gate, of sporadic small arms fire echoing within the Senate building, and of the president being secured at an undisclosed location. Another theory suggested a bloodless but coercive internal coup where the military high command, backed by factions of the Federal Security Service (FSB), presented Putin with an ultimatum he could not refuse, leading to his forced resignation or detention. The complete blackout from the usual chorus of state media commentators, political analysts, and Kremlin-connected bloggers only deepened the mystery. Their social media accounts fell silent. Their television chairs remained empty. It was the silence of the powerful, and it screamed of upheaval. The military's physical takeover of the city's neural centers was systematic and visibly overwhelming. Within an hour of the broadcast, tactical units of the National Guard, or Rosgvardia, historically a counterweight to the army and directly subordinate to the president, were conspicuously absent from key positions. They were replaced by regular army infantry supported by BTR-82A armored personnel carriers and Tiger light armored vehicles, their main guns sweeping empty intersections. Soldiers in full combat gear, their unit patches hastily removed, established checkpoints at every major entry and exit point to the city, the MCAD Ring motorway, major railway stations like Kazansky and Leningradsky, and the highways leading to Sharativo, Domodedovo, and Venukovo airports. The airports themselves were shuttered with flights canceled en masse, leaving thousands of travelers stranded in terminals now patrolled by soldiers. The Central Bank of Russia, the Ministry of Finance, and the Moscow City Exchange building were encircled by layered perimeters of troops and razor wire. State television headquarters at Ostanino and the offices of major news agencies were similarly garrisoned. The message was unambiguous. Control over information, finance, and movement now resided with the military. It was this demonstration of raw, unchallenged authority that ignited the exodus. The initial public reaction was not mass protest, but mass calculation. Musquits, a populace seasoned by the shocks of the 1990s and the controlled stability of the Putin era, possessed a deep-seated instinct for survival. The sight of tanks on the streets triggered a collective memory of August 1st, 1991 and October 1st, 1993 moments of violent intra-elite conflict that spilled into public view. The decision for thousands was not political but pragmatic to remove themselves and their families from a potential zone of conflict. Panic buying stripped supermarket shelves of pasta, canned goods, and bottled water within 2 hours. Long disorderly queues formed at ATMs as people sought to withdraw physical cash, a tangible asset in a suddenly uncertain digital economy. Then they headed for their cars. By noon, the outward-bound lanes of every major highway from Moscow, the M1 to Belarus, the M10 to St. Petersburg, the M2 to Ukraine now closed at the border, the M4 to the Caucasus transformed into frozen rivers of stalled metal. Social media footage uploaded via satellite internet before localized blockades could be imposed showed scenes of surreal desperation. Families sat in luxury sedans and aging lotties alike, engines off to conserve fuel, children staring blankly from back seats. Some vehicles, having run out of petrol, were pushed to the shoulder. The railway stations, though officially closed, became gathering points for thousands hoping for a reprieve, only to be met by cordons of impassive soldiers. The southern and northern riverboat terminals witnessed a scramble for private barges and pleasure craft, any vessel that could move down the Moskva River. For those with neither car nor hope of train, the only option was to walk, leading to images of citizens hauling suitcases on foot along highway margins, heading towards the relative uncertainty of the countryside, Dhaka, and provincial towns. The scale of the movement suggested a breakdown in the fundamental contract between state and citizen, the expectation of basic security. People were voting with their feet, and the tally was a condemnation. The international reaction evolved through distinct phases: initial disbelief, frantic intelligence gathering, and then a coordinated, cautious response. The first alerts in Western capitals came not from diplomatic cables, but from satellite imagery and signals, intelligence showing unusual armored column movements from bases in the Moscow Oblast converging on the capital after midnight. The abrupt cessation of all secure communications from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and the British Embassy, followed by the imposition of a total communications blackout from within the Russian government, confirmed a catastrophic internal event. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session in New York, but proceedings were mired in procedural chaos. With the Russian ambassador now wholly disavowed by the powers in Moscow, unable to receive instructions and refusing to speak, NATO held a virtual summit of its North Atlantic Council, placing all alliance forces on a heightened state of alert, or DEFCON 3, while explicitly stating no aggressive movements were being made. The predominant mood among world leaders, as captured in a leaked excerpt from a G7 conference call, was one of extreme peril. We are looking into a black box of unimaginable consequences. One European leader was reported to have said, "The man who commanded the world's largest nuclear arsenal is missing, and the people who now control it have not identified themselves." China's response was characteristically inscrutable, but deeply concerned. A foreign ministry spokesperson called for stability and calm in Russia and the peaceful resolution of internal affairs, avoiding any endorsement or condemnation of the military council. Behind the scenes, analysts noted the People's Liberation Army rocket force was placed on a heightened readiness status, a move interpreted as defensive precaution rather than aggressive intent. Of immediate global economic impact was the reaction of markets and commodity traders. Within minutes of the Moscow broadcast, the off-exchange trading for the Russian ruble collapsed with bid prices evaporating. The price of Brent crude oil surged by 18% in Asian trading, and European natural gas futures spiked by over 40%, recalling the worst fears of the early weeks of the Ukraine war. The Moscow exchange, of course, did not open. This financial tremor revealed the world's continued exposure to Russian resources and the frightening vacuum at the center of a major energy and grain producer. Global supply chains, still fragile from recent years of disruption, braced for a new shockwave. To understand the precipitous fall of the Putin system, one must examine its inherent and cultivated weaknesses. The regime constructed over nearly a quarter century was not a monolithic dictatorship, but a vertical of power, a system of balancing competing security factions, oligarchic clans, and bureaucratic elites, all personally loyal to the figure of the president. Its stability was predicated on Putin's role as the ultimate arbiter, the Sarbatka, who could redistribute wealth, settle scores, and grant protection. This system functioned effectively in times of economic growth and limited geopolitical confrontation. However, the war in Ukraine acted as a profound stress test, exposing and exacerbating its fatal contradictions. The military campaign, initially envisioned as a swift special operation, degenerated into a brutal war of attrition, costing hundreds of thousands of casualties, consuming vast arsenals of Soviet-era equipment, and exposing glaring deficiencies in logistics, command, and morale. The professional army was decimated, replaced by a force reliant on hastily mobilized reservists and convict recruits from the Wagner private military company. This created a new class of battle-hardened, politically aware veterans and commanders who grew increasingly disillusioned with a political leadership they viewed as corrupt, out of touch, and militarily incompetent. The economic underpinnings of the system also corroded under the strain of comprehensive Western sanctions. While the state redirected the economy onto a war footing, boosting production of artillery shells and drones, the civilian economy stagnated. Inflation eroded living standards. The elite's access to Western luxury, education, and assets was severely curtailed. The social contract, political quiescence in exchange for material stability began to fray. Putin's response to these mounting pressures was not liberalization or a genuine peace offensive, but a further tightening of control, intensified repression, escalating nuclear rhetoric, and a purge of the military leadership after the brief Wagner mutiny of 2023. He removed his longtime associate Sergei Shoigu from the Ministry of Defense, replacing him with the technocrat Andrei Belarus. This move, intended to improve wartime economic efficiency and curb military corruption, was deeply resented within the general staff. It was perceived as a civilian's usurpation of military domain, a signal that blame for the faltering war was being laid at the feet of the uniformed professionals, not the political leadership that had conceived it. The formation of the Council for the National Restoration of Order appears from fragmentary area intelligence and expert analysis to be the culmination of this fissure. The council is believed to be dominated by a faction of Siloviki from the military and hardline elements of the FSB, who concluded that Putin's continued leadership guaranteed not victory, but the prolonged degradation of Russian state power, potentially leading to a catastrophic defeat or even the disintegration of the Federation itself. Their ideology is not liberal or democratic. It is one of nationalist salvation. They likely view the war as an existential struggle against NATO that is being mismanaged. Their aim, analysts suggest, is not to end the war, but to win it by any means necessary, mobilizing the full totalitarian capacity of the state without the political constraints and corrupt inefficiencies of the Putin systema. Figures like General Servikin, with his record of indiscriminate bombardment in Syria, represent this ethos of ruthless escalation. The arrest or neutralization of Putin was not the end goal, but a necessary step to remove what they saw as a compromised and ineffective supreme commander, clearing the way for a more radical and focused war effort. The immediate social consequences within Russia extend far beyond the traffic jams of Moscow. Petersburg, a city with a strong tradition of liberal intelligentsia and close European ties, Spontaneous anti-coup protests erupted in small clusters on Nevsky Prospect, only to be swiftly and violently dispersed by army units using stun grenades and batons. In the Urals industrial city of Yekaterinburg, workers at a major tank factory reportedly walked off the job, refusing to take orders from the new military management. The most volatile region, however, is the North Caucasus. In Chechnya, the powerful strongman Ramzan Kadyrov, whose loyalty was exclusively to Putin personally, declared in a fiery video address that his Kader-C forces would defend the legitimate authority and called the military council traitors and usurpers. This sets the stage for a potential civil conflict within Russia's borders, as Chechen units loyal to Katarov and other regional militias could clash with federal army forces. Meanwhile, in the ethnic republics of Buryatia and Dagestan, which have suffered disproportionate casualties in Ukraine, there are reports of local leaders refusing to acknowledge directives from Moscow, sensing an opportunity to assert greater autonomy in a moment of central weakness. The economic impact is instantaneous and paralyzing. With the central bank under military lockdown, the Russian financial system is frozen. Interbank transactions have halted. The SWIFT international payment system, from which most Russian banks had already been expelled, is now a moot point as domestic clearinghouses cease operation. Citizens' digital banking apps show balances, but are unable to process payments or transfers. This thrusts the economy back towards a barter system and cash transactions. But physical cash is rapidly disappearing from circulation. Major corporations, especially those in the resource extraction sector like Gazprom and Rose, face an impossible dilemma. Their overseas assets are likely to be seized by foreign governments, and their chief executives, oligarchs who built their fortunes under Putin's patronage, are now targets of the ascendant military high, which historically views them with contempt as corrupt parasites. The ruble's effective death as a convertible currency means Russia's crucial energy exports, oil, gas, and coal, can only be sold for other currencies or gold, complicating trade even with partners like China and India, who will demand steep discounts for assuming immense political risk. The foundation of the Russian economy, the flow of petrodollars, is in severe jeopardy. Internationally, the crisis forces a brutal reckoning for Ukraine and its Western backers. For Ukraine, the sudden decapitation of the Russian leadership presents both a historic opportunity and a moment of extreme danger. Military analysts caution that a new unified and ruthless Russian command could prosecute the war with even greater ferocity, potentially unleashing tactical nuclear weapons to break the stalemate. Conversely, internal turmoil could force a operational pause, allowing Ukrainian forces to regroup and counterattack. Diplomatically, the West faces a dilemma of unprecedented complexity. Who does it negotiate with? The vanished Putin, the anonymous military council, the Biden administration in the United States, along with the European Union, issued a joint statement declaring they do not recognize the illegitimate military authority in Moscow and continue to recognize the diplomatic representatives appointed by the previous government. However, this is a holding position. The urgent, unspoken question in every capital is the security and command and control of Russia's vast strategic nuclear forces, estimated at nearly 6,000 warheads. The nuclear briefcase, or Chedet, is designed for use by the legally constituted president. Its status is unknown. The chain of command from the political leadership through the general staff to the rocket forces is now broken and reconstituted in an unrecognizable form. This introduces a terrifying variable into the global security equation: the potential for unauthorized or miscalculated use during a transfer of ultimate authority. In the wake of a silent military takeover that emptied the capital streets, the new ruling council for the National Restoration of Order moved decisively to dismantle the Russian state and impose absolute martial law. The world is now confronting the rapid unraveling of a nuclear superpower, facing economic catastrophe at home and triggering alarms across global capitals, fearful of spillover conflict and nuclear miscalculation. On the second day, the council issued a series of stark decrees read by junior officers on state television, leaving no doubt about its totalitarian intent. Decree 1 dissolved the State Duma and Federation Council as cesspools of corruption. Decree 2 announced a full total mobilization of the economy and male population, canceling all military service deferments and nationalizing private enterprise for the war effort, a word now used openly. The most chilling decree established military tribunals for the defense of the state with the authority to hand down summary death sentences for sabotage, espionage, and spreading defaced information, economic collapse, and social fracture. The economic consequences were instantaneous and severe. The ruble effectively ceased to function with hyperinflation, causing prices for basic goods to double within hours in cities like Novosk and Vladivostok. The financial system froze, barter reemerged, and critical infrastructure began to falter as workers walked off the job. The state's seizure of corporate assets triggered chaos at giants like Rosneft and Gazprom, where managers faced mutinies from workers demanding hard currency. The carefully built network to bypass international sanctions collapsed, paralyzing the export of vital resources and raising the specter of hunger in remote import-dependent regions. Socially, the nation is tearing along pre-existing fault lines. The mass exodus from Moscow and St. Petersburg has created a reverse refugee crisis, overwhelming provincial towns. More dangerously, the mobilization order has sparked open defiance in ethnic republics. In Dagestan, women blockaded military commissariats. In Yakutia, local leaders announced they would handle conscription independently. The most critical flashpoint is Chechnya, where strongman Ramzan Kadyrov, loyal only to the vanished Putin, declared his republic a zone of stability. In a video from a fortified compound surrounded by his Kadyrovsky fighters, he labeled the military council traitors and usurpers and threatened to treat any federal forces as an invading army, creating a de facto secession and the imminent threat of civil war. International alarm and nuclear uncertainty. The international community, having absorbed the initial shock, is scrambling to formulate a response, though deep divisions have emerged. NATO has activated its response force and deployed additional assets to its eastern flank, stating, "These are purely defensive measures." The European Union took the significant step of invoking its strategic compass for a full embargo on all transactions with entities controlled by the Houthi. Diplomatically, a rift is evident. France and Germany, fearing a nuclear-armed failed state, have cautiously suggested establishing back-channel communications with the Council to manage the security environment. The United States and United Kingdom staunchly oppose any form of recognition, arguing it would legitimize an illegal coup. The UN Security Council remains paralyzed. The most critical and secretive discussions globally concern Russia's nuclear arsenal. The secure hotline between US and Russian strategic commands is dead. Western intelligence agencies are frantically working to map the new opaque chain of command for nearly 6,000 warheads. The prevailing assessment is that operational control has likely passed to the head of the Strategic Rocket Forces, General Sergei Karakai, a career missile officer. While analysts believe the Huna's first priority is securing these weapons, the risk of miscommunication or unauthorized action during this transfer is described by one former Pentagon official as higher than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world is navigating a period of maximum nuclear uncertainty. Information war and alternative centers of power within Russia, a fierce information war is underway. The Houthi, controlling state media, broadcasts a narrative of patriotic national purification, blaming corrupt Western-facing oligarchs for the nation's ills and vowing to win the war. In opposition, a newly formed Committee for National Salvation comprising figures from the dissolved parliament, former ministers, and liberal opponents, is broadcasting appeals from exile via proxy servers, calling for resistance and seeking international recognition as the legitimate government. However, it commands no military or media assets. Significantly, the Russian Orthodox Church, a longtime pillar of the Putin regime, has pointedly withheld support from the Junta, with Patriarch Kirill issuing only a vague plea for peace and unity. Global shock waves on the Ukrainian front. Global economic shock waves are intensifying. Spiking energy prices have forced emergency rationing in Europe and frantic market diversification in Asia. China, facing strategic chaos on its northern border, has sealed its frontier with Russia and suspended financial links. For nations in Africa and the Middle East reliant on Russian and Ukrainian grain, The crisis signals an immediate threat of bread shortages and social unrest. All eyes are also on the 2,000-kilometer front line in Ukraine. Military analysts report contradictory signals, a slackening of artillery fire in some sectors suggesting a pause, countered by reports of fresh, unidentified Russian units deploying in the south, possibly loyalists to the new council. There are also disturbing but unconfirmed signs of increased activity at Russian tactical nuclear storage sites. Western intelligence assesses the Huna will need days or weeks to consolidate internal control before making a decisive military move abroad, providing a narrow and precarious window. Historical parallels and an uncertain future. Scholars are drawing parallels not to the Soviet collapse of 1991, but to the fall of the Tsarist regime in 1917, a system that entered a major war with confidence only to be shattered by its economic, military, and political costs. The military council resembles the provisional government that briefly held power before being overthrown by a more radical, ruthless faction. By the end of the third day, a grim enforced tension has settled over much of Russia. In areas under firm military control, a semblance of order is maintained at gunpoint. In rebellious regions, a tense standoff prevails.